We're on air. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are in whatever time zone. I'm Polly LaBarre. I'm the co-founder and editorial director of The Mix, and I'm so delighted to be here hosting another in our series of Maverick Hangouts. And this is a very special hangout. We're really hanging out. We've got 4 for the price of 1. We're talking to the Maverick entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, hackers, next generation leaders from New Zealand-based Enspiral, which is a collective of professionals and social enterprises really dedicated to making a positive impact in the world and changing the world in a meaningful way, but also rethinking the way that we organize and mobilize human beings and resources in a way that's much more inclusive and human and collaborative and inventive. And those of you who spend time at The Mix know that is a mission that is near and dear and central to our hearts. So I'm really delighted to have them here. I should just let you know some background that Enspiral, via the work of Alana Krauss, has been the recipient of not 1, but 2 of our recent M prizes around digital freedom and also unleashing human potential. So we have some of the key players in those stories here tonight, and we'll sort of unpack how they did it and what other aspiring organizational innovators can learn from them. And I'll just say we have, as usual, the Twitter conversation going on. So please, if you have questions or comments, post them at #MixHangout. This is going to be available both live and then archived on our Maverick Hangout page forever, so you can continue the conversation that way. But what I thought I would do, since we have 4 leaders from Enspiral, instead of reading through lengthy bios, I just would love you all to sort of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do, and then we'll get into the Q&A. And so maybe, Alana, I'll start with you.
Oh, yeah, I'm Alana Krauss. I've been working with Enspiral for about 3.5 years now. I'm also one of the founders of Lumio, the collaborative decision-making app that you mentioned a moment ago. And I've been working with the Enspiral Foundation, which really supports all of the different enterprises and social entrepreneurs in the network.
Great. Ben?
So I'm Ben Knight. I come from an academic background originally, studying the evolution of collective intelligence in humans. Got really sick of going down the academic track and the painful slowness with which knowledge is translated into anything with meaningful impact in the world. So came back to New Zealand and got involved in social justice activism, and came into contact with Enspiral at the peak of the Occupy movement, which I was heavily involved with. And basically, the introduction to Enspiral was us asking them to build us this tool for collaborative decision-making that we had thought of, that would allow general assemblies, would allow activist groups to organize democratically across distance. And their response being, well, you're going to have to build it yourselves, but we need it as well, so we'll give you a desk, and we'll give you an internet connection, and we'll help you along the way. So 2 years on, and we're still embedded firmly in the network, and it's been the reason that Lumio exists is having this nurturing ecosystem of social innovators around us.
Fantastic. That's a great segue to Joshua. I guess we're going alphabetically, which is very, very democratic. So, Joshua, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm a web developer. Been doing that for a while. Maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I got much more interested in social change, and I was just an independent contractor, and I decided to start connecting more with people who want to make a difference too, and just started turn my personal consulting company into a collective venture to make a difference in the world. So that pretty much just looked like me saying yes to every contract that came my way, scrambling to find people to help fulfill them, helping people who wanted to make a difference earn a bit of a livelihood through our work, and then just seeing what happened next. And yeah, it's been an amazing journey over the last few years.
Fantastic. Sylvia?
Yeah, hey, I'm Sylvia Zer. I have a background in event management, facilitation, and youth work. I spent 3 years working for an international youth organisation right across Europe and North America, but came back to New Zealand about 3 years ago and came in touch with Enspiral through some good friends. And I noticed just the awesomeness of all the people and all the knowledge and all the skills that were in this network, and I started asking the question, how can we connect all of these people, and how can we make this knowledge more available to people that are not directly in the network? And so that was one of the questions that triggered me to co-found a social enterprise here called Chalkle. So Chalkle has the core goal of connecting people of things to teach with people who want to learn. But we use the internet to connect people online, but all our classes happen offline. So what we're really doing is asking the question of further education in the current education system. What is the role of technology there? How can we use it to centralize the things that need to be centralized, but at the same time enable it to facilitate the decentralization of knowledge sharing and education directly in our communities. So at the same time, we're sharing knowledge, but we're also developing and building communities at the same time. And Chalkle was born about 6 months, I think, perhaps 8 months after Lumio. And so we've been, we're kind of sibling organizations within the Enspiral family.
A little sister.
Yeah, we're the little sister of Lumio.
It's sort of like Match.com, but for something truly useful. So that's amazing. Well, and I think through these introductions, you're getting a great feel for this incredible organization, which I have just become so fascinated in and learned a bit about, and I'm so excited to learn more about tonight. And really, I've started to think of Enspiral as this kind of 21st century form of organization that, you know, is doing all this amazing stuff with the different social enterprises in your orbit, but also has become a real lab for, you know, hacking the way we organize, manage, and lead. You know, essentially how we help people accomplish things together in a better way. So I thought, Joshua, I might start with you, because I think in some way you sort of described the sort of founding story of Enspiral as kind of, you know, I just sort of started this and I want to see what happened, and maybe there's a little bit more to that founding story or the journey from that initial decision to do something with social impact and to kind of, you know, exercise your freedom as an independent contractor, and the other folks in the world who might be interested in doing that too. So maybe you could just sort of give us that sort of beginning journey and kind of from here to there, how you got there, and I'm sure it's not exactly what you expected would happen.
Very unexpected, I'd say. I think for me the core idea at the beginning was that when you look at global issues and the big challenge we face, we know how to fix a lot of them, and the core issue is that just we're not putting the energy in. There's just not enough people working on it, and so the initial spark of this idea was that we just need more working on stuff that matters. So it was really about creating something which more people could work around, and then we could start to have an impact. But then I think that there was a lot of thinking which has been sort of quite strong throughout the time around what's the company of the future going to look like. And it feels like, I think one of the big inspirations at the time was Clay Shirky and Here Comes Everybody and his sort of theory of organizing on the internet. And I think that the analogy for me is sort of like we've got hundreds of years of organizations acting like an organism which didn't have much intelligence. And the internet basically has given us a central nervous system. So when you look at building an organization now, I think that the technology we have, but more importantly, the culture that emerges upon that technology, profoundly changes what it means to be in an organization or to organize with others or to collaborate in general. And particularly around how money, information, and control move within an organization. Traditionally, that's centralized, and the dominant organizational form is a pyramid and a hierarchy, and that makes sense when it's expensive to transact information. But when it's much cheaper and faster to do that, I think the more efficient and optimal organizational form is a network one, where money, information, and control are consciously decentralized. So I think that thinking, as well as learnings from like software development and agile and the sort of open source movement, sort of coincided into just experimenting with what it means to be in an organization. And we just sort of drew inspiration from all sorts of places. You know, Ricardo Semler, cooperative movements, open source, like a whole bunch of different places which are fairly well known, and just started playing with them and just saying, what does it look like to build an organization where you don't have salaries, or where you don't have a management layer, or where transparency is the norm, or experimentation is the way you go about creating a future. And so it's really just been find good ideas, copy them, apply them, see what works. And it's just one step at a time, to create something which really works for us.
That's amazing. I mean, it's sort of the story we're trying to promote and see happen in larger, more entrenched organizations that would have to make a real transformation to get from here to there. And I wonder, I mean, I love this notion, and I think it's so important that, you know, inventing the future happens via experimentation, and the whole notion of, you said, we just played with it, that it doesn't happen through a top-down design. But did you start as a group or as an individual and gathering a group of folks around you with a set of principles or values, or, you know, some kind of founding sense of purpose that's still part of who you are? Was that also, did that also emerge over time?
That emerged, I think, about 12 to 18 months in. So we were active for about a year, and I think that I remember we probably had about 20 or 30 people in the network after a year, and that's when I always had the vision of, you know, if one person or a small group of people try to own or control something, it will dramatically limit its potential. It's by giving full power and ownership away to the wider community that we can create something truly living. And that I always thought that that would be a long-term process to basically take what was my baby and my dream and give that control over, so that I'm just one more voice in the room rather than the final, you know, veto right in a way. But it took about 12 months before I'd found, I think it was 11 people or 12 people who I trusted enough to say, okay, let's give each one of you a share in the company. We are the ultimate locus of power in this group. And then it's consensus of that group which steers the ship. And then each year it's basically been widening that circle. So now I think it's something like 33 people in that sort of membership group. And so I'd say that, yeah, so we didn't really have a written vision statement or principles or whatnot. I can't remember exactly when they came in, but it was somewhere between year 1 and year 2, I think.
Yeah. And I think maybe one way to get at, you know, how governance works and how people work together in an organization such as Enspiral, which is, you know, truly, you know, an alternative to traditional organization, is to talk a little bit about some of the sort of companies / apps / you know, hacks that you've created around core organizing principles. And so I'm thinking specifically about two that I know fairly well through the enterprises, or Lumio and Co-Budget. For those of you out there who haven't had a chance to read the stories, you really should check them out on the Mix. But this whole notion of, you know, on the one hand, thinking of a new way to think about collective decision making, and then on the other hand, hacking some of the most basic approaches in organization, you know, budgeting or direction setting, these sort of boring, age-old, ineffectual processes. You've created not just sort of really compelling and sticky apps around it, but a whole worldview really that I think we can learn from. So let me just start with Lumio and hear a little bit about the story of that, because I mean, Ben, as you intimated, that's a really fascinating founding story. Here you've got, you know, Occupy Wellington hooking up with an organization like Enspiral, and what you produced was this incredibly compelling, simple tool for productive collective decision making. So tell me a little bit about Lumio and how that got started.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing Joshua describe that there was no sort of explicit written values statement or mission statement at the time that Lumio joined Enspiral. So even though nothing was written down, it was an initial conversation with Joshua that had a very, very explicit social purpose, describing Enspiral as, describing the structure of it, and realizing that the structure he was describing, the networked, non-hierarchical, explicitly horizontal participatory structure, matched perfectly with, you know, the ideal social organization setting that so many social movements are striving towards. And just understanding that match between what we were driving for and what they were driving for, from very different directions but towards the same goal, was really what got me hooked. I mean, the other part of it was Joshua describing the way that he described the problem, the challenge that we're facing at the moment, and coming right out and saying, right now, most businesses are based on stealing. They're based on extracting more value than they're producing. And hearing that laid out in a very explicit way, and also hearing, you know, the idea of how that can be fixed in a really simple, sort of fundamental way by reversing reversing the priorities of profit maximizing business. So just saying, well, start with a core social purpose, have a social mission, and generate revenue. Use the tools of business, the immensely powerful tools of business and revenue generation to drive that social mission. So hearing that sort of fundamental priority shift really got us excited, and that was when I guess the sort of collaboration really started. And then I guess it was sort of as soon as we'd really started building it, Enspiral were, what were they, the group number 2 or group number 3?
The first real users.
The first serious users of Lumio, and 2 years later are still like one of the heaviest user groups on there. So they picked it up and started using it for, well, I should say we. It was sort of, as soon as we started working together, we just felt very much at home in the Enspiral ecosystem, and came into Enspiral membership like fairly early on. And the team, I mean, basically Lumio started when that collision happened, and Alana as a co-founder, Joshua being really, really influential in the early stages of Lumio being born. And then other people through that network, other people from the community sector, other people from business backgrounds and from activist backgrounds, technology backgrounds, all coming together around this idea. But seeing the way that Enspiral just picked it up and started using it, and for us, you know, as a software development project, being completely surrounded, working in a co-working space where everyone around you is using the tool that you've built on a day-to-day basis. As soon as something goes wrong, you build some bad user experience, you've got 30 people surrounding you, telling you how it's making them feel. So having that immediate feedback loop between this real-world use case and actually being in the middle of it. And, you know, we're using it to participate in decisions about how the co-working space runs, right up to strategic business decisions, people collaboratively developing employment contracts, running the foundation, and just sort of living right in the middle of the thing that we're developing has really helped us maintain that flexible, adaptive approach, like genuinely using Lumio to build Lumio. Yeah. At the same time that Enspiral is using Lumio to build and develop Enspiral.
There's so many meta layers here, but tell us just, I wish we could see Lumio right now. We probably could share a screen, but we won't do that right now. But tell us a little bit about the tool and the approach itself, because I think actually, like Enspiral itself, what you're doing is you're transcending one of those really sticky trade-offs in organizational life. And in the case of Lumio, it's that trade-off between sort of efficiency and engagement. You know, how do you make, you know, good decisions in an efficient manner, but how do you also include people, develop shared understanding, get all the information and the diversity that you need? And I think that's what Lumio is doing in a really powerful way. But maybe just describe the tool and how it works, and we'll get to that.
Yeah, great. So I mean, the core trade-off, I think you've articulated really, really well, and it's sort of also about maximizing coordination and maximizing autonomy at the same time. So really, like, getting that individual collective balance right. So Lumio itself, I mean, fundamentally, it's about being able to talk about something as a group and make clear decisions with actionable outcomes. So, you know, we're all using online tools every day to exchange information. The transacting cost of information exchange has come right down, like, through the floor since the advent of the internet. But the transacting cost of making a decision, of getting that information through a collective process to shared agreement that can then be turned into real-world action, that's still really, really difficult. So anyone that's tried to make a decision by email knows that as soon as you're involving more than, say, 3 people, it's virtually impossible to just bring it to a clear conclusion. It's just not email is not a tool that was built for that. Social media tools were not built for that. So all Lumio does really is provide a semi-structured environment where any group can come together, talk something through, and make a clear decision that can be put into action. And so as soon as we got it up and running, Enspiral were a first user, then, you know, we were getting contacted by government departments and city councils, as well as neighborhood groups and, you know, organic food networks. And then in the last, so in the sort of preceding, in the 18 months after that, We've seen it expand out to social movements in Hungary and in Spain right now. There's this enormous grassroots social movement, the Podemos movement, that have started 400 Lumio groups in the last month and thousands of users and have essentially doubled our user base. So we've got this really interesting mix of commercial and non-commercial users. So it's being used in business settings right through to grassroots social justice activist settings.
I love it. And I think, Alana, you said to me one time, if you follow the news, you can follow the development of Lumio, new languages, new groups joining it. And so I really get why this is a fantastic tool for social movements. But one of the things that we always say at the Mix is we need more social movements inside hierarchies, inside, you know, the business organizations that we see out there. Have you seen any interesting uses of it inside a rather traditional organization, or do you have a sort of theory of the case of how an approach like this could sort of be a Trojan horse or help change the way decision gets made, or as Joshua talked about, the way information gets circulated and control gets distributed inside an organization?
I think at the core of it is that it's essentially a technology that lowers the cost of involving more people in decision making. So it's really about just making it easier, less expensive in time and money to involve more people in the decision-making process. So we see it being picked up in some really quite traditionally structured government departments, using it for things like multi-stakeholder engagement and collaborative policy development. We also see it being picked up in large community organizations and NGOs that have a deep sort of values commitment to decentralized power, but have really struggled to structure that into their organizational life, and have just sort of inadvertently ended up building these like really quite traditional hierarchical structures. So it's been picked up by a pretty amazing community organization, a mental health services provider in New Zealand with, I think, 800 staff around the country, and they've got a deep commitment to decisions being made as close to the people they support as possible. But they've never been able to really put that into practice using anything online. So Lumio is the tool that they've adopted to do that, to really roll decision making out, to push it out as close to the real work that they're doing in real communities as possible. So that, I think they present a really compelling model for how a large organization can use a tool for decentralized power, decentralized decision-making in a scalable way.
And I'm correct, it's as many things are that you all create, there's a real generosity associated with it. It's free, so it's not like your CEO has to say, you know, this is an app that, or your CIO has to say, this is an app we're using. Anybody can start to use it inside a group, any kind of a group, in any kind of an organization.
So the core value of Lumio, the core functionality, will always be free of charge, but commercial users pay a sort of license fee. So commercial users pay a subscription to use it. We're currently developing a customer base in New Zealand. We haven't put that automated business model online yet, but that'll be coming in the next sort of 6 months.
Great. Well, I want to bring Alana and Sylvia into the conversation. I mean, I think we can go so deep into so many things, but something we might want to address, and I think this idea of experimentation and you know, as a way of inventing the future is so key, and it seems like so many things that have happened in Enspiral have come about because of a need inside the organization, or a need from a fellow professional, and you've just sort of thrown yourselves into it to create it. And I guess, you know, the question behind that is, how do things get started at Enspiral? You know, how do you create the budget for it? How do people come together to start something? And this is a question that I think is important for all kinds of organizations, you know, outside of the kind of traditional top-down sort of, you know, centrally planned way of getting things done. How do you start something when, for instance, you don't sort of own the whole system? So that's kind of a double question, but Alana, maybe you could tackle that.
Sure. Well, in general, I could explain in general, then maybe Sylvia, you could talk about how it was actually forming Choco in this environment, because you kind of explored all these aspects of how it works. But in general, we tend to keep the sort of barriers to entry very low around the edges. So we're very open about how we do things. We're very transparent. We have lots of events which are open to the public. We have an open door policy in our co-working space. A lot of times people just come hang out. You know, we have drinks on late on a Friday afternoon, that kind of thing. And we tend to just get to know people, and it also happens online. You know, we host a lot of sort of spaces online where people can interact with us, and you'll find that a lot of different kinds of people come and just start exploring, and we're really trying to be open and supportive around that, and lots of great conversations start happening. If people feel that values alignment, usually they start to understand what this thing is, and then they're just like, oh my God, how do I get, I'm gonna quit my job, you know? This is not everyone. A lot of people also keep their jobs and then just kind of keep hanging out with us until they find their foothold and make that jump. It usually does take a little bit of time, because we don't have like job openings, and we don't have things like very structured. We don't have necessarily an onboarding process. It's intentionally vague because I don't believe that we really have the answers. It's sort of it's a mutual exploration. So we leave it quite open. So those barriers around the very edges are quite low, and then they start getting a lot higher quite quickly in terms of the barrier to entry of being an Enspiral member right at the core is, I would say, fairly high. We take a long time to get to know people and then have a really heartfelt and in-depth discussion on Lumio when we go to invite them as a member and really explore their values and their interests. And of course, it's a mutual thing. You know, we extend an invitation and then have a lot of deep conversations with the person. Is this really where you want to be putting your energy? And if it's a match, then it'll go forward. And the kind of commitment that we see is something I've never seen at any other organization, that it's because everybody feels like they own this thing along with everyone else, that it's a vehicle for them to achieve their aspirations in a supportive environment. So it's I think incredibly conducive to a lot of commitment. So yeah, those people take that journey from just sort of being friends and hanging out and then getting closer and closer until they kind of get into the core, if that's the right direction for them. And in terms of how projects start, it's just in that process, people just start talking and start coming up with ideas. I mean, it's what happens if you put a bunch of really entrepreneurial people together with a very good skills mix. What you end up with is people starting companies, pretty much. Yeah, sparks just start flying. But the difference is that it's not just ideas in a vacuum. It's these sparks are on this really sort of fertile ground, and this, you know, things just catch because you've got these cross-functional teams which can form with no friction because we're all already in here. We all already have these working relationships, the shared values, the processes. We're all using the same online tools and in communication and understand how to work together so that when an idea does come in, very quickly a team will coalesce and things can be launched incredibly effectively. Maybe you want to talk about your experience with that.
Yeah, I think it's a really nice question to ask, you know, how do things start? And whenever I meet new people, I always like to hear sort of the biography or the genesis of an idea. And to be honest, I think in Wellington, I read a stat once that we have the most cafes per capita in the whole entire world. So my answer to you would be coffee.
Well, at least it's not beer, which it usually is when you're in Australia and New Zealand.
Great people, as Alana said, you know, great people, like-minded people in one room together or in one cafe over a cup of coffee, exploring ideas and being really in tune to what's going on around them. That's how things start. So I guess two core examples that I can share is one is how we started Chalkle and then also how we started the Social Enterprise Week last year. Is that Chalkle began with me meeting another Enspiral member, Link Gasking. We went out for a cup of coffee and we discussed two things. We discussed transport and education. And we were discussing what we were noticing around us. We brought both of our ideas. Link had very much sort of a tech online community background. I had very much a facilitation, group process, alternative education background. And it was through that meeting and the different perspectives that we were then like, wow, hang on, there's something here. And I think mixed in with that, we had noticed within Enspiral the real needs that we were having in Enspiral. And Enspiral's very much like a microcosm of the macrocosm. So here in Enspiral, I was noticing all these different skills and knowledge, how can I start to connect them? What does professional development look like in a decentralized way where suddenly everyone's a teacher and everyone's a learner? So we started Chalkle just by literally going, oh, Alana, can you teach this? Okay, I'll get 10 people in a room, they'll each pay $10. Sweet, we've got a class. So everything in Chalkle was done manually first, and then trying to solve a really local problem, but having a global vision. So I think that's one of those things that we're all really want to solve the practical needs that happen out in that co-working space, but we want to make a really big dent in the universe at the same time. So it's that, let's start something small, but let's make certain it has a global vision. The other option, so that was kind of, just a little bit how Chalkle started. And the other thing that might be worth mentioning is last week we hosted one of the first social enterprise. Last year. Last year we hosted the first, one of the first social enterprise weeks, and in that we hosted a social enterprise conference. The reason we did that is my personal reason, because I organised that conference, was I just wanted to know more about social enterprise. I was like, everyone was starting to ask us stuff, and I was like, well, I don't really know much about social enterprise. I might be running a social enterprise. The best thing I can do is organise a conference, get all the people in the room who know a whole lot of stuff about social enterprise. They can teach the 180 people to come, but my actual secret scheme was actually so that I could learn and upskill myself. So I put in a conference, which ended up being a week, and through that process, we upskilled a whole lot of people about social enterprise. But again, we were responding to a real need of how can we upskill New Zealand, well, Wellington and New Zealand in the context of social enterprise. Yeah. So I think overall what I've really noticed is responding to a problem, coming up with a real MVP solution, Excel spreadsheets, paper, let's just get this stuff done. There's not much of a talk fest here. People can only talk for so long, and then they go, right, what's the next step? Getting that done, but at the same time acknowledging the global vision and the real wish to create some social impact.
Yeah, now there's something so important there that I think is really transferable, not just to an organization like yours that really, I think about sort of the fantasy if you kind of disrupted block by block the traditional organization and thought about, building the 21st century organization, what would it look like? I think it kind of looks like Enspiral. So if you're not in that kind of organization, but you still want to sort of make this journey, one of the things that we talk a lot about, and I think it's ripped through everything that you do, is this notion of a culture of experimentation. That again, you can't kind of design something wholly and design it top down and get it perfect before you start. So Sylvia, you said something about manual, local beginnings. Alana, when I talked to you about co-budget, you talked about scrapping around with the Excel spreadsheet and just kind of really cobbling something together and trying it out on your colleagues. So maybe through the story of co-budget or another story, just tell us a little bit about how you start things, how you iterate, how you prototype. I mean, it really is a story of how you launch an experiment and how you turn everyone in your midst into, the lab rats and also experimenters, with that confidence to do that.
Well, that's a brilliant analogy. The lab rats. In a way, I feel like the fact that we're completely bootstrapped, like have nothing extra left over at the end of a budget, is almost a strength. And I think that's kind of strange to say, but like we have no choice except to try to solve our own problems as efficiently as possible. And we really don't have the option to go build a bunch of software that no one's going to use or that's not going to solve the original problem we set out to solve. And as Joshua said, the initial way that Enspiral was started was with computer programmers and people who believe deeply in sort of the agile approach. And I think that DNA is very deep in our culture, and it's not just about software, it's about sort of how you think about every kind of process design, organizational design, everything that we do, we approach in a really iterative way. So we'll start something that will just piece something together with whatever we have and give it a try and try to learn as much as possible. And so for things like Enspiral retreats, which we do twice a year, they're all have been totally self-funded with nothing extra, and every time we learn about how to do them better, more effectively, more efficiently, and then 6 months later we do another one, and every single, there's never a time when it just stops and gets calcified, and this is how things are done from now until forever. And there's never a time when it's like, oh, it doesn't matter, we just need to spend, we have more budget than we need to think about, we don't have to worry about it being efficient. So I think that's, in a way, that's a really productive environment for developing new process and new software. I think for me personally, part of it is just my complete impatience with like anything other than let's just get out there and do things and try something, and I've got a problem and I want to just start messing around and trying to solve it as quickly as possible, and combine that with really effective feedback cycles. And I think you have a really positive way of starting something out of nothing. It really does feel that way sometimes. I think I really have to credit Joshua as well. The attitude he takes is very much just like, okay, we'll go for it. It'll be fine. We'll piece it together. Like, it's just, starts running and then kind of worries about putting together all of the plans or the resources, and just sort of jumps and assumes that by the time you land on the other side, the ground is going to be there to meet your feet. It almost always works, I have to say.
Do you not say almost?
It's okay. I think it is that really entrepreneurial, not afraid of failing, and that if you're not failing a decent percentage of the time, you're probably not reaching your potential. So for me, I'm a little bit more cautious. I'm a little bit more of a planner, I think. I will start, very small, and then start worrying about, okay, how are we going to have the resources and this kind of stuff, whereas Joshua will be out several steps ahead. But I feel like we have the right mix of people that's good, that those kind of complement each other. And so there's like a new idea out there, and I come back behind and start putting together the practical pieces, and somebody will come up behind me and start putting together the even longer term, let's think about capitalization or whatever, these longer term pieces that need to come into place. And then by the time, we're already out there, we've learned so much. By the time we're ready to do the big part of the project, we actually know what we want to build, and we know that it's going to be useful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, I mean, that is such an incredible sort of metabolism, I think, for an organization to have. And I'm wondering, Joshua, maybe I'll ask you, but it's really a question for all of you. As you think about, everything that you talked about, in a way, seems like if you tried to make that happen inside a more traditional organization, while every organization is talking about innovation and invention and experimentation and failure, yet they don't have a huge appetite for it or an ability to metabolize it the way that you just discussed it. What would be the sort of the journey? I mean, it's kind of like, leadership reform school, or, boot camp for the denizens of traditional organizations. Folks who, say someone inside a fairly traditional organization, 3-4 levels down, doesn't have the power necessarily or the capital to start something. But what would be, from what you've learned, what would be your advice for how do you get started where you are with what you have? Because that's essentially what you're talking about.
I think that's a really difficult design problem. Like, we had the luxury of starting from fresh, and I think it's a completely different environment when you're already in something that exists. I do think that there are some things that might be applicable, though. Like, for me, earlier on, we were talking about the trade-off in decision-making between efficiency and speed of making a decision and wider collaboration with people who are affected by that decision. And I think in some ways that is a false trade-off, in that the fastest way for me to make a decision is just to give me all the information, I'll make a decision, everyone do what I say. But the damage that does to a community is that it disempowers and alienates everyone else, and actually getting the decision implemented will be a lot more costly and ineffective. But I've also basically traded speed, I've traded social capital for speed, and that when you look at the most valuable resource a company has, or an organization has, it's the depth and the quality of the relationship amongst its members. And so one of the guiding principles I had early on was like the relationship before the deal always. It doesn't really what decision or what outcome happens here. It's important. That stuff needs to be as good as you can get. But more important is the quality of the relationship between both parties afterwards. And I think that can be a different mentality and way of thinking, which you can apply to any environment, which is my primary purpose as an active member of this organization is to nurture the depth and quality of relationships amongst its members. And then then deals or projects or budgets or everything starts to look as essentially as a relationship building tool. And that when you consciously invest in those relationships, you start to get an asset or a capability which you can't get any other way. Like when you have autonomous, passionate people who are completely involved in the mission of the organization, that's invaluable. And I think that that's also probably a precursor. That level of commitment or community is a precursor to creating an environment where it's safe to fail or it's safe to be innovative. Because if there's no trust between the members, I can't innovate, I can't take a risk because I'll suffer harm from it. Whereas if there is trust and there is a deep and enduring relationships, then it's a much safer place for people.
That's such a beautiful way of putting it, and so powerful, and it actually feeds into a question that I think you all have sort of pointed to, which is this question of that sort of social fabric you were just talking about, which is, Alana, I think you said we all understand how we work together. You know, we understand how to work together. And in an organization that's sort of as distributed and diverse as Enspiral, where there are not so many rules but a lot of norms, tell me a little bit about how you build that fabric. You've talked about retreats. You've talked about different ways that you work together, because I think that's another piece of it. I think, Joshua, that lens that you gave, that's just such a powerful starting point. But then what are some of the forums or the tools or the approaches that you use to really nurture that?
On a really practical level, we as a group tend to use certain online tools which are really, really helpful, and we're constantly trying out new ones, and we don't have any rules about which tools you can use, but we do have a culture of try to use the same ones over and over so you don't have to start over from the beginning every time. But if you do find something better, you know, make the jump. So we use things like the whole Google Apps domain, Google Docs and Hangouts and Drive, and all of that is really useful for us. Trello, HipChat has been great for it. We just started that this year for more real-time communication. We've got an online community, a private Google Plus community where we share sort of everyday links, and then of course Lumio, where we make all of our decisions together. So that's a way. So that's kind of how we communicate online. So when you start a new project with someone, there's no, you know, oh stop, I'll teach you how to use Google Docs. It's just like I've shared the document with you. Jump into the chat on there. You know, we're immediately like writing together. There's no friction there, which is, I think, you know, it seems like a small thing, but to me it makes a really, really big difference. There's also what I consider to be more the sort of human or cultural technology, which is not about necessarily the digital tools, but it's about how we talk to each other. When we have meetings, we often start with a check-in round, just checking in, how is everyone, where are you at in this meeting, trying to emphasize things that are oftentimes forgotten, which are about really facilitation and nurturing human relationships, like, where is everybody at? How do we come together in this moment and get in the right headspace to work together? How do we acknowledge that people are whole beings, not and they don't leave behind all of their personal stuff and all of their family and the fact that they're sick, you know, just because they walk into a boardroom. That's real and that's part of who they are, and we know each other on a personal level. So things like retreats, you know, going away together for a few days. And again, this is not like mandatory, but people opt in because they discover the value of it. We didn't make up any of this stuff. We're definitely standing on the shoulders of giants in terms of facilitation techniques, in terms of all of these cultural practices. Sometimes, you know, quite large giants, like cultural traditions in New Zealand. We have the great fortune to be exposed to the traditional Maori culture here, which I think informs some of the thinking about how people come together. There are social movements from a generation or two or three ago that we've been lucky enough to be exposed to through some of the people in our network. And then of course we make it our own, and we do innovate. Really emphasizing the work of facilitation and space creating. You know, how do you Things like taking notes. That's not, some lowly job. That's like one of the most important things that happens at a meeting. Scheduling. That's actually really important. And this goes back to us, our emphasis really on valuing diversity, that we sort of start with I think a lot of us came to this with a bit of rejection of the traditional status symbols of a lot of traditional organizational life, or in the wider society, where it's always the person on the top of the pyramid has all the status and all the sort of grunt work is not really valued. Like, actually, a lot of times it's the person who makes the snacks and means that and brings them to the room so that people can feel good and awake throughout the whole meeting. That is deeply important work. I can't emphasize that enough. So it's the real diversity of the different kinds of work that go into how people come together and communicate.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And so how do you, so much of the conversation in organizational life is about leadership, and there's so much focus on leaders and the charismatic leader or founder, and it's how so many organizations work, and it doesn't seem to be how you work. So how do you talk about leadership inside Enspiral, and maybe more importantly, the work of leadership, or do you? Is that not even a word you use at this point?
It might be worth to distinguish the difference between leaders and managers, and also it's, there are still different management structures and there are still different leadership structures, but it's about using them at the right time and place. It's about how, I think a lot of the tools that Ilana mentioned, and I think you've just got to see management and leadership as another tool in that suite, and every time a situation comes, you go, okay, what tool is needed to be able to address this situation? And we don't always get it right. For example, there was a ridiculous Lumio discussion going on recently in the space about should we get a new printer? And to be honest, my opinion was, someone should have just made that decision and bought a new printer because everyone was perspective. So that might have been where we got it wrong. But there's other times when, when one of us needs to go and stand up and actually make a call, when someone's having a rough time, and actually we need to put in a management structure. If there's a project that needs to happen, if there's certain accountabilities, if there's a contract, if there's a budget, you go, well, actually, we need to have accountabilities in this, and this human being needs to have a manager. They need to have someone to check in with every Monday morning. Okay, let's put in that structure. You might say then that person that they're checking in with would be their manager, but we just don't call them that. We might just say, okay, I'm checking in with them, I'm making certain that they're accountable. So I guess what I would say is that it's about what is the decision that needs to be made, what's the right tool that needs to be used in this moment, and let's make certain that we use that. And that's where the experimentation comes in, and that's where we definitely don't get it right every time. But if you're focusing on the human being and trying to make positive impact, then I think you're more likely to get it right. But
I can just give an example that Sylvia did within the last couple of weeks, which I was incredibly impressed by in terms of real show of leadership. I'm currently transitioning from one role to another, and I kind of just put it out there to the group, like, okay, I need to step back from this so I can focus on this other stuff, then someone else has to do all this other stuff. And of course I was kind of stressing out, like, oh no, what's going to happen? Are the pieces going to be picked up? Like, we don't necessarily have a process for this. And Sylvia kind of took just step back at the beginning, let people share what they thought, let people try out some ideas, then noticed that there were different conversations going on in different places that actually were interrelated, and then picked her moment, and stepped out as a leader. And this is not because she's in charge of this situation or it's her job, but it's because she just felt it was her moment to lead, and said, okay, everybody, we're going to have to get together in a room and discuss all of this instead of in pieces. We're going to discuss it all together. Put a call out, hey, members, come to this meeting. It was only a couple days before the date. It's last minute. Not everybody can be there. That's fine. But almost all the members came out, which was deeply, really touching to me, that people felt that this kind of call for help that I'd put out was really important. They'd made the choice to come. Sylvia got up in front of the room and was like, okay, I've had to think. I've developed a process. We're splitting into 3 groups for half an hour. You solve this problem. You solve that problem. You solve that problem. Everybody go. And, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. This works because everyone there, had done the work to have a lot of the context and had longer relationships and a personal connection to this issue. It's not out of nothing, but the fact that Sylvia was able to hold that quite clearly and strongly and facilitate. It's that leadership from below. Like, let's take all of the potential here, put it together, send it in the right direction, and then at the end of that, everybody came back into the room. We realized we'd kind of all come to the same conclusion. The answers became clear. I felt so much better. Everybody felt so much better. And it was some quite deep decisions for Enspiral. And then Sylvia was able to pull it together, say these are the next steps. And to me, that's real leadership. Everybody in that situation felt empowered. We were getting the great ideas from everyone. It was clear what we were going to do, and the problems were getting solved. And nobody had to be a boss for that to happen. Everybody contributed in their own way. And Sylvia stepped in as the leadership for that moment. And then when that meeting ended, she was again a member alongside everybody else with her piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And I think we often find it a lot more useful, rather than talking about leadership, to talk about the tangible things that people actually mean when they say leadership. So, good leadership, essentially, I don't know, in my mind at least, comes down to two elements. A good leader is someone who's really good at coordinating a group of other people around a shared purpose, and really good at motivating that group of coordinated people to achieve that purpose. And that's a role that can sit within one person, that coordination and motivation role, or it can sit distributed between multiple people. And the ideal scenario is when you've got that spread around an entire group of people, when everyone's paying attention to how to coordinate the group, and everyone's paying attention to how to keep the group motivated to achieve that purpose. That's the ideal scenario, because you can take out any individual person and the thing keeps doing what it was set up to do really effectively. So we do talk, I guess, when we talk about leadership, we often talk about distributed leadership. But more often we'll talk about things like facilitation and coordination. And
empowered delegation.
Yeah, empowerment. Yeah, and delegation.
It doesn't mean everyone's involved in every decision.
Absolutely. I know, decision making in particular. It's like this. There was a text written in the 1970s called "The Tyranny of Structurelessness" by a woman called Jo Freeman. And this has been really influential in our thinking and designing Lumio, but I also think the ideas have permeated through Enspiral as well. The idea that having no explicit management structure does not mean that everyone's going to be empowered. Often you get these informal hierarchies and informal management structures that are even more tyrannical than any explicit structure. So the goal is to avoid the tyranny of structurelessness and to develop tyrannyless structures. So really distributed structures that maximize autonomy and coordination at the same time.
I think we have our bumper sticker for this Maverick Hangout. That was fantastic. and you're absolutely right, because everything that you just described around coordination and motivating people and putting them together, this is all the work of managing, and it's the work of leading, but we sort of fetishized it around one particular model that was invented 100+ years ago to maximize, to solve for different challenges than we have today, and to be a different kind of an organization. To that end, you all have talked about transparency in one form or another, and I think in a way this might be an important wedge for a lot of organizations thinking about this journey, because we've seen, not just in organizations like Enspiral, but industrial organizations like W.L. Gore or the Morningstar Company, which are kind of great examples of self or peer management and regulation that are very emergent in a way that Enspiral is. That transparency is this incredible sort of antidote to control. It's very conductive of this sort of social fabric and social shared understanding that you talked about. Now, is transparency just the soup you swim in, or do you see strategies for kind of always being vigilant about promoting transparency and thinking about it as a tool? And again, that's to anyone, because I think you all probably experience it in different ways.
I think transparency is incredibly challenging. It is no joke how hard it is. Even for an organization like us, who we are very open and don't have many secrets, and we don't have draconian confidentiality policies or anything like that, but we still have to work very hard, and it's because it's not about just the information being available. It's about actually being accessible and make sense to people and be communicated in a way that can engage with meaningfully and be hooked into real decision making, and why am I being told this information and how is it relevant to me, and this is a big page of numbers, I'm just going to ignore it. You know, in a way, it's the other side of it is everyone here is extremely busy and will only engage with what feels relevant to them. So the people who are trying to communicate out have to do that work to make it, okay, we have to make sure we're communicating what's important, because the other side is, you know, information overload, the other side to transparency. So I think it's, I definitely don't think we've cracked it. I just think we've learned about how important it is, which is really the first step. And I think some of the things we've done, like Lumia and like co-budget, are incredibly important for transparency because they're processes which are really easy to engage with, which are empowering for the individual who is participating, and through participation, you know, people understand what are the decisions we've made and why. People understand how much money do we have and where is it going and how do I influence that. But yeah, I think that I feel like that's an area I would like to really explore much further and much more deeply, because I feel like it's incredibly important and complex, actually.
I don't know if I've been. For me, the main takeaway about transparency is that it's expensive to do right, and the bar of transparency has been raised. Like, one of the consequences of rich information systems is just a ton more data than used to be around. Like, you know, a couple of decades ago, if you did something like publish the P&L and the financials amongst an organization and disclose people's salaries, that is a radical act of transparency. And that data isn't that actually useful in terms of orientating an organization. So I think that when you look at rich information systems, you need to have small pieces of information delivered to people without them asking for it when they need to know it. And that's a really difficult information challenge to manage. And I think co-budget's a really good example of, like, from the beginning, we were publishing financial reports. A small number of people would engage with them. It wasn't very relevant to their decision making. But when you turn budgeting into a game where you have money which you can allocate, the consequence of that game is you walk away knowing how much money was spent, what was it spent on, what are the fundamental financials of this organization. And so I think that when we look at how to tackle transparency in general, we just need to increase our capability to provide richer information systems to people which operate more like games.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is we're closing in on an hour, and I feel like we could continue to go so deep into, and we've only scratched the surface. But I think what we've seen is that these terms that we throw around a lot, like transparency and collaboration and co-creation and in participation, and these sort of the holy grail of this sort of environment that we're all operating in, there's a lot of subtlety, there's a lot of sort of trench warfare to get it right, and you all are sort of doing that day in and day out at Enspiral. So maybe I'm going to leave you with a last question, and what I'm really going to urge everybody out there to do is to learn more about Enspiral and to read the stories on the mix, and if you're a kindred spirit, to connect with them in some way, because I know those sparks will continue to happen. But I guess I would say, you know, what's next on the agenda for Enspiral? I mean, Alana, we've had this ongoing conversation about kind of tackling one by one these core management processes and kind of hacking them, or thinking very differently about how people organize. What is on your sort of bucket list at Enspiral?
Well, maybe we can each answer. I mean, the thing is that we don't have one answer to that. We're going to have one answer for every person at Enspiral. So it'd be cool to hear from everyone. I mean, we did this really cool process this year to develop for the first time an annual strategy. So we have a Enspiral 2014 strategy, and that was a really cool process. We used an open collaborative process to develop the strategy. I would love to see us do another iteration of that at the end of this year for the 2015 strategy. So if you do want to know what we've got 4 strategy points. We publish them on the website. That's technically what we're all doing. In terms of, where I see Enspiral heading, I think I always say this because I'm a inveterate optimist, but I think it's going to be a massive year. But it's because there's a lot of projects that you've been incubating, like Lumio, for a long time, are just set to really explode internationally. Enspiral's presence internationally is starting to become known, and I just feel like yeah, we've solved some key questions about resourcing and coordination and the right people in the right place, and I think it's like we've been sort of tilling the soil for a long time, and something big's about to grow out of it. So I don't know, maybe I don't want to presuppose, but I want to hear what these guys have to say.
So I guess one of the things that's already emerging this year, so a really sort of fresh, exciting possibility that's emerging, is around interoperability, around getting all the different technologies that are being developed at Enspiral to all work really well with each other. So part of that is around, figuring out how to get CoBudget and Lumio to work really well together. So you can seamlessly have a collaborative discussion and decision-making process to determine your strategy and then the things that will need funding, and then be able to move really, really easily into the mechanics of actually getting the funds collaboratively allocated. So that's a really exciting sort of first example, and I think it's going to be one of many. So there's something called the Open App Ecosystem at Enspiral that's being developed right now, which is sort of the core engine that all these different modules can plug into to give a really sort of comprehensive but also lightweight suite of tools for, I guess, taking Enspiral's core organizational DNA and making it viral. Really making it easy for other social organizations in business and in communities and in government settings to adopt a lot of the core practices that we're finding really effective. So I mean that's a partnership. I mean that's sort of a collaborative exercise within Enspiral, but it's also my sense, and I haven't really even talked with other people at Enspiral about this, but within Lumio we're having all these conversations with other really exciting projects internationally. So with Commotion, mesh networking, community Wi-Fi for secure and resilient community-owned Wi-Fi networks, Lumio integrating with that, and then the Enspiral ecosystem integrating with that to really deal with security and resilience issues. And then another is Democracy OS, which is a really large-scale citizen participation platform coming out of Argentina. So having Lumio integrate with that and then bringing the Enspiral open app ecosystem, the possibilities are just kind of limitless.
I'm getting really excited.
You guys didn't know that world domination was on your agenda for the year.
So this is stuff that I haven't even told Alana about yet.
Perhaps I would just say I'm excited about the next problems. Actually, Alana spoke about some of the strategy of what we're doing with Enspiral, and Ben's talking about that sort of wider collaboration. But really, at the heart of it, if you look at a lot of the ventures, we're looking at old-fashioned, crumbling systems which are dying, and it's the new that we're excited about. What is that phoenix that's going to rise from the ashes? Lumio is asking some deep-seated questions around our democracy system, which is based on this ridiculous historical system that is so irrelevant to today's society. At Chalkle, we're looking at an education system which is based on an industrialized age where you go in one system and you come out and you're prepared for a job that you knew at the beginning. Our jobs are changing so fast nowadays. Social media marketing manager was a job that didn't exist 5 years ago. So what does an education system look like that's more based on, a renaissance of learning rather than in an industrial streamlined system? And Buckybox, which is another one of the social enterprises, is looking at the food system. And I guess where I'm excited about is going, well, what is that next problem that's going to come on our doorstep? What is that next industrialized system that we're going to smash with the internet hammer, the community hammer, the collaborative hammer? And none of us know. And I think it comes back to what you were saying of, how does this all start? Well, it starts when great people come together and try and solve deep-seated, meaningful problems. So I'm just excited what the next problems are going to be.
Make us sound like the Planeteers.
we're totally the Avengers.
Yeah.
At the same time, I've got a busy focus on the problem I'm trying to tackle, but that's the part that I'm definitely excited about.
Sure. Joshua, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the thing which excites me the most is probably thinking about, I guess, exchange of organizational DNA worldwide. And I think that's where the mix work is so fantastic. Like, I mean, if we look at the impact Lumio co-budget, our membership structure, or a handful of other things have had on Enspiral, they have been absolutely transformative and revolutionary for us. Like, we would not be here today if the Lumio team hadn't shown up and built that tool. We just couldn't have coordinated the way we wanted to. If we were still budgeting, how we were 2 years ago, we would look really different as well. So I'm really excited about the next transformational piece of technology or cultural process coming from outside the network. So something that we see someone else doing and importing it in and saying, look at this thing and how does that transform us? Or for other organizations to look at things that we've done or other people have done and actually adopt them, put them in, implement them, and transform their organization from that. So we can start to have much more of a international exchange of tools, practices, and processes, and be part of a global movement, basically upgrading the way we organize. And so I think there's little bits of the mechanisms which need to be in place for that to work, like speaking the same languages, having similar interfaces into processes, and I think that work I think is really exciting. So interoperability with other interesting organizations is top of my list.
I love to hear you say that, because that's what we're trying to do at the Mix, as you say. And so we're bringing Alana to the U.S. In November for the Mix mashup, so that she can infect all the other organizations, but also so that you all can pick up some of these great hacks and progressive approaches, and hopefully bring back to Enspiral, because we're all trying to make progress collectively to make organizations more human and to have more meaningful impact in the world, just as you've said. So I am completely jazzed and inspired, and I could really continue this conversation for 4 more hours. So we'll have to do that offline and in different ways. But I want to thank all of you for joining this and doing it as an experiment and having four of you on at once. I think it worked pretty well, and thank you all so much.
Thanks, Polly.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.